The man staring back at you from that 2008 mugshot doesn't look like a monster. Tom Petters looks like your neighbor, the guy who coaches Little League, the businessman who shakes hands at church on Sunday. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Because while Minnesota called him a philanthropist, while politicians posed with him at charity galas, while his name appeared on buildings across the Twin Cities, Tom Petters was orchestrating the largest fraud in state history. $3.65 billion. That's not a typo. Billion. With a B. And here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. He did it for 10 years, right under everyone's noses, using brands you trusted. Polaroid, Fingerhut, Sun Country Airlines. But those weren't businesses. They were props in the most elaborate con Minnesota had ever seen. You want to know how it all came crashing down? It started with a phone call. September 8, 2008. A woman named Deanna Coleman walked into the FBI office in Minneapolis with a list. A simple piece of paper that showed her boss, Tom Petters, owed investors $3.5 billion for merchandise that didn't exist, for deals that were never real, for 10 years of lies wrapped in expensive suits and charitable donations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because Tom Petters didn't start out as a con artist. At least that's what he wants you to believe. Let's go back to 1973. St. Cloud, Minnesota. Tom Petters is still in high school, working in his family's tailor shop. It's a business his great-grandfather started over 100 years ago. Good, honest work. The kind of place where a handshake means something, where your word is your bond. That's the Minnesota way, right? Tom learned those values, and then he learned how to weaponize them. While his classmates were worried about prom dates and graduation, 17-year-old Tom Petters started his first company, Ear Electronics, a mail-order stereo business aimed at college students. Not a bad idea for a kid. He made some money, got his first taste of success. Then he did what a lot of young entrepreneurs do. He dropped out of college after one semester to chase bigger dreams. The 1980s took him to Colorado. He managed electronics stores, learned the retail game. When that company went bankrupt, Tom saw opportunity where others saw failure. He tried to buy some of those locations. It didn't work out, but it taught him something important. Other people's disasters could be your fortune. Remember that. It becomes crucial later. By 1988, Tom Petters was back in Minnesota. He founded Amicus Trading, a wholesale brokerage company. The business model seemed straightforward enough. Buy consumer merchandise in bulk, sell it to retailers, make the difference. Televisions, electronics, consumer goods. Big boxes needed inventory, and Tom Petters said he could supply it. The name changed to Petters Company, and business was good. Or at least it looked good. In 1995, he opened Petters Warehouse Direct in Minnetonka. Picture those outlet stores you loved in the 90s. Overstock merchandise, closeout deals, bankrupt company inventory sold at a discount. It was legitimate. It was profitable. It was perfect cover for what came next. By 1998, Tom Petters had moved online with redtag.com. The internet was exploding. E-commerce was the future. In 2001, he partnered with Fingerhut, one of the most recognized names in catalog sales. Their new site, redtagbiz.com, reportedly hit $1 billion in sales. Tom Petters was no longer just a businessman. He was becoming a brand, a success story, the American dream in a Minnesota accent. But that same year, 1998, something else started. Something that wouldn't come to light for another decade. Tom Petters created what prosecutors would later call a series of investment funds. The pitch was simple, and it sounded almost boring in its legitimacy. Petters Company Incorporated, or PCI, needed short-term financing to buy consumer electronics in bulk. They'd purchase the goods, sell them quickly to major retailers like Costco, Sam's Club, Best Buy, and Walmart. Then pay back investors with impressive returns. sometimes 15, 20% in just a few months. For investors, it seemed like a no-brainer. Tom Petters had the track record. He owned legitimate businesses. He had connections to major retailers. The purchase orders looked real. The bank statements looked solid. And the checks? The checks cleared. Early investors made money. They told their friends. Those friends invested. Made money, told their friends. That's how Ponzi schemes work. They have to pay the early investors, because those early investors become your best salespeople. You're probably wondering, what's a Ponzi scheme exactly? It's named after Charles Ponzi, who ran one back in the 1920s. The concept is devastatingly simple. You don't actually invest people's money in anything real. You just use new investors' money to pay off old investors. It works perfectly until it doesn't, until the day you can't find enough new money to pay the old promises. Then the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. But here's what made Tom Petters' scheme so effective. He had real businesses. Polaroid, Fingerhut, Sun Country Airlines. These weren't fake companies. They were real brands with real employees doing real work. In January 2005, Petters Group Worldwide purchased the Polaroid brand for $426 million. Polaroid, the camera company that defined memories for generations. If you're over 50, you remember Polaroid cameras, the instant photos, shaking the picture while it developed. That nostalgia, that brand recognition, it bought Tom Petters something money couldn't buy: legitimacy. In 2006, he acquired Sun Country Airlines, a real airline, with planes and pilots and routes. Petters Group Worldwide became massive. 3,200 employees, investments in 60 companies, offices across North America, South America, Asia, and Europe. $2.3 billion in revenue in 2007 alone. Tom Petters was living the life most people only dream about. His primary residence? A $5 million home on Lake Minnetonka, one of Minnesota's most exclusive addresses. But why stop there? He also owned a $9.5 million estate in Manalapan, Florida, private beaches, a dock for his yachts. Yes, yachts, plural. He had private jets, luxury cars, the works. And he was generous. That's what made it so perfect. Tom Petters threw charity galas that attracted Minnesota's political elite. Governor Tim Pawlenty attended his events. Petters donated to causes, put his name on buildings. He looked like a pillar of the community. When you're writing checks to charity, people don't ask uncomfortable questions about where the money comes from. But inside Petters Company Incorporated, the machine was grinding. Deanna Coleman, his vice president of operations since 1994, was the face of PCI to investors. She and Bob White ran the day-to-day operations. They created the purchase orders. They handled the paperwork. They dealt with the investors. And they created mountains of fake documents. Pretty much everything on the purchase order was fake, Coleman would later testify in court. Tom would raise some money. I'd create a purchase order for $1.2 million to $1.5 million, and the investor would give us $1 million. Think about that for a second. 99% fake. That's what Coleman admitted. 99% of the electronics supposedly being bought and sold through PCY didn't exist. There were no warehouses full of televisions, no pallets of laptops waiting to ship to Best Buy. There were only fake purchase orders and bank transfers moving money in circles. The scheme worked through phantom suppliers. PCI would tell investors they were buying merchandise from vendors. The investors would wire money to these vendor accounts. The vendors would take a commission and pass the money back to Petters Company. Except these vendors were fake. Shell companies. Between January 2003 and September 2008, approximately $12 billion moved through these sham accounts. $12 billion going in. About $12 billion going out. But there was no real merchandise, no real sales. Just money chasing its own tail while Tom Petters bought airlines and lived in mansions. You might be thinking, how did nobody notice? The FBI actually talked to Petters back in 2002. An agent came asking questions about a vendor PCI was working with. Deanna Coleman called Tom and told him the FBI was coming. He called his lawyers at Fredrickson and Byron. They had a meeting. Petters told the FBI what he knew. The vendor had some problems. They'd closed their bank accounts. PCI wouldn't do business with them anymore. The FBI said okay and left. Years later, Tom Petters would say he wished he'd asked more questions that day. That maybe if the FBI had looked deeper, everything would have been different. But here's the thing. The FBI was looking at the vendor, not at Petters. And why would they suspect Tom Petters? He owned Polaroid. He owned an airline. He was rich, successful, and generous. That's the insidious thing about con artists operating at this level. They don't look like criminals. They look like you. They attend the same churches. They coach your kids' sports teams. They donate to hospitals. The higher you build the legitimate facade, the less people question the foundation. By 2008, that foundation was crumbling. The financial crisis was hitting. Credit was tightening. New investors were harder to find. And when you're running a Ponzi scheme, you need constant fresh money. Without it, you can't pay the old investors. And when you can't pay old investors, they start asking questions. Uncomfortable questions. Petters owed money to several parties, and there wasn't enough cash coming in. Audits that he claimed covered all of PC. I turned out to only cover parts of the operation. The parts that looked legitimate. The parts that weren't feeding on fake documents. And the pressure was building. Inside PCI's offices in Minnetonka, panic was setting in. Deanna Coleman and Bob White had conversations about going to the FBI. They knew it was only a matter of time. Someone was going to flip. Someone was going to save themselves. The question was, who would it be? By September 2008, Tom Petters was in Las Vegas at the Bellagio, desperately trying to understand how bad things really were. He was meeting with Larry Reynolds, another key player in the scheme, hoping Reynolds had records that could explain the chaos. Meanwhile, back in Minnesota, Deanna Coleman made a decision. On September 8, 2008, Coleman and her attorney walked into the U.S. Attorney's office in Minneapolis. She brought that list. $3.5 billion owed to investors, most of it to hedge funds, but also regular people, business owners, people who trusted Tom Petters because everybody loved Tom Petters. The federal prosecutors were stunned. This wasn't some small-time fraud. This was potentially the largest Ponzi scheme they'd ever seen. And this woman sitting across from them was offering to help bring it down. There was just one thing they needed her to do: wear a wire. Deanna Coleman agreed. She went back to Petters Company headquarters carrying 2 covert recording devices. For the next 2 weeks, she recorded conversations with Tom Petters and Bob White. She captured hours of audio that would later become crucial evidence in court. In one conversation, Tom Petters admitted they'd created fake purchase orders. In another, he talked about hoping for divine intervention to explain how they'd avoided getting caught for so long. Divine intervention, as if God was helping him steal billions of dollars. But the recordings also captured something else: fear, desperation. Tom Petters crying, telling Deanna Coleman she was the only person he'd cry in front of. He talked about investors he was afraid of. Bob and John Sabes, who ran a Minneapolis financing company and stood to lose up to $19 million. Petters was convinced they had mob connections. He told Coleman he thought they might kill him. "The reason I want to get Sabes paid off is I think he'd kill me," Petters said on one recording. Bob Sabes would later tell a reporter that Petters had been watching The Sopranos too much. But whether the threat was real or imagined, it showed how far things had fallen. The man who'd owned Polaroid and flown private jets was now scared of his own investors. On September 22nd, 2008, just 2 days before everything exploded, Coleman recorded Petters saying he was still trying to find a way out. "I may not be able to get us out of this, but I think I can," he told her. Even then, at the very end, Tom Petters thought he could talk his way through it. Find one more investor. Buy one more day. He couldn't. On September 24th, 2008, dozens of FBI agents descended on Petters Group worldwide headquarters in Minnetonka. They raided his home in Wayzata. They searched offices and seized documents. Employees stood watching, confused, as federal agents carried boxes out of the building. Some of them had no idea what was happening. They thought they worked for a legitimate company. They had families to feed, mortgages to pay, and now they were watching their employer implode on national news. The FBI criminal complaint was devastating. It identified fake vendors, shell companies, billions of dollars moving in circles, phony purchase orders from Sam's Club and BJ's Wholesale Club. All of it designed to make investors believe PCI was running a massive, profitable operation buying and selling consumer electronics. The truth was simpler and uglier. It was all fake. The deals were fiction. The merchandise didn't exist. For 10 years, Tom Petters and his closest associates had been running one of the largest frauds in American history, hiding it behind legitimate businesses and charitable giving. 10 days later, on October 4th, 2008, Tom Petters was arrested. The booking photo shows a man who still can't quite believe it's over. He's wearing a button-down shirt. His hair is neat. He looks like he's posing for a driver's license photo, not a mugshot that would appear in newspapers across the country. October 13th, 2008. Petters Group Worldwide filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. 3,200 people lost their jobs. Investors lost billions. The brands Tom Petters had purchased, those real companies with real employees, were thrown into chaos. But the legal process was just beginning, and the recordings Deanna Coleman had made, they were about to become the most damaging evidence in the case. The trial of Tom Petters began in November 2009 in U.S. District Court in St. Paul. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country, investors who'd lost everything, employees who'd lost their jobs, family members on both sides, and at the center of it all, Tom Petters, facing 20 counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence: bank records, fake purchase orders, email chains, financial documents. But their most powerful weapon? Those recordings Deanna Coleman had made. Hours of Tom Petters' own voice, captured on tape, discussing the fraud. Deanna Coleman took the stand as the prosecution's star witness. She was 43 years old. She'd worked for Tom Petters since 1994, 15 years of her life dedicated to PCI. She'd been his vice president of operations, his trusted lieutenant. And during 2005 and 2006, they'd had an intimate relationship. Now she sat in federal court, under oath, about to destroy him. Coleman's testimony was methodical and damning. She explained how the scheme worked from the inside, how she'd create fake purchase orders almost daily, how Tom would raise money from investors and she'd fabricate documents showing they were buying electronics worth slightly more than the investment. The investors would wire the money to phantom vendors. Those vendors would take their commission and pass the rest back to PCI. Everyone got paid until they didn't. Pretty much everything on the purchase order was fake, she testified. The merchandise, the vendors, the deals with major retailers, 99% of it was fiction. The defense attorney, Paul Eng, came at Coleman hard. He got her to admit she'd lied to investors almost every single day she worked for PCI, that she'd stolen $350,000 from a shell company without Petters' knowledge, that she'd paid her boyfriend $100,000 a year for a job he never actually worked, that she'd hidden money from her ex-husband during her divorce by giving large payments to her boyfriend and brother.
"You stole from Mr. Petters, didn't you?" Eng asked.
"Yes,"
Coleman admitted. The defense strategy was becoming clear. Deanna Coleman and Bob White were the real criminals. They'd run this fraud behind Tom Petters' back. He was a successful businessman who trusted the wrong people. He was a victim, too. But then the prosecution played the tapes. The courtroom fell silent as Tom Petters' voice filled the room through the audio system. These weren't third-party accounts or remembered conversations. This was Tom Petters himself, recorded without his knowledge, talking about the scheme. In one recording, Petters and Coleman discussed fake purchase orders. He didn't sound confused or victimized. He sounded like someone who knew exactly what was happening and was trying to manage it. In another tape, Petters talked about divine intervention being the only explanation for how they'd avoided getting caught for so long. You don't credit God for helping you avoid detection unless you know you're doing something that should be detected. The jury heard Tom Petters crying on tape, telling Deanna Coleman she was the only person he'd break down in front of. They heard him express fear that certain investors might try to kill him. They heard desperation and panic, but they also heard knowledge, awareness, complicity. The defense tried to counter with their own interpretation of the tapes. They played recordings where Bob White and Deanna Coleman discussed whether Tom really knew what was going on. "I'm pretty sure I know," White said in a sarcastic tone, "and I can't say for sure if Tom knows." White then broke into laughter. "Tom knows," Coleman responded on the tape. "He just doesn't want to think about it." In another recording, Coleman told White that Tom believes these are real deals half the time. See? The defense argued. Tom Petters was in denial. He'd convinced himself it was legitimate. He didn't understand the full scope of what Coleman and White were doing behind his back. But the prosecution had an answer for everything. They produced emails from Petters to Coleman from 2003 saying it was absolutely okay to put her boyfriend on the payroll. They showed records of Petters' extravagant lifestyle, $5 million homes, $9.5 million estates in Florida, private jets, multiple yachts, luxury cars. Where did he think all that money was coming from? Prosecutors called David Margolis, Petters' personal assistant from 2004 to 2008. His testimony damaged the defense claim that Petters didn't know the background of Larry Reynolds, the Los Angeles wholesale operator who helped facilitate the fraud. Reynolds had a criminal past and had been in the federal witness protection program. Defense attorneys had argued that if Petters knew about Reynolds' history, he never would have done business with him. Margolis testified that Petters did know. The trial lasted a month. Testimony from dozens of witnesses, hundreds of exhibits, thousands of pages of documents. And through it all, Tom Petters sat at the defense table, maintaining that he was innocent, that he'd been betrayed by people he trusted. The prosecution painted a different picture. They showed how Tom Petters had used investor money to finance his acquisition spree. Polaroid, Finger Hut, Sun Country Airlines. These weren't sound business investments bought with legitimate profits. They were purchases funded by fraud, real companies bought with fake money. And when those companies needed more capital to operate, Petters would find more investors for PCI. More fake purchase orders, more phantom electronics deals. The Ponzi scheme fed the empire, and the empire gave credibility to the Ponzi scheme. Between January 2003 and September 2008, approximately $12 billion had moved through PCI's sham vendor accounts. $12 billion in, roughly $12 billion out. But none of it was generating real profit from real merchandise sales. It was just money going in circles, with Peters and his co-conspirators taking cuts along the way. The jury heard testimony about M&I Bank, which later became BMO Harris Bank. The bank had handled PCY's accounts. Prosecutors suggested the bank should have noticed something was wrong. Nearly $40 billion had passed through PCI accounts over the years. Yet, there were never deposits from the major retailers that PCI claimed to be selling to. No payments from Costco, nothing from Best Buy or Walmart. The money just moved from investors to vendors and back to PCI in a continuous loop. If you were watching those bank accounts, it would have looked suspicious. But M&I Bank didn't report it. They didn't alert regulators. Years later, bankruptcy trustees would sue BMO Harris, arguing the bank had been complicit in enabling the fraud. In 2022, a jury would award $564 million to Petters victims, finding the bank liable. BMO Harris said they'd appeal. But back in that courtroom in November 2009, the focus was on Tom Petters. The jury had to decide, was he a criminal mastermind, or was he a successful businessman betrayed by his employees? On December 2nd, 2009, after deliberating, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 20 counts. Wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The jury didn't believe Tom Petters was innocent. They didn't believe he was a victim. They believed he'd orchestrated a $3.65 billion fraud that destroyed lives and devastated investors. Tom Petters showed little reaction as the verdict was read. His family members in the courtroom wept. Investors felt a mix of vindication and emptiness. Guilty verdicts don't give you your money back. They don't restore the retirement accounts. They don't undo the damage. Sentencing came on April 8, 2010. Tom Petters stood before U.S. District Judge Richard Kyle, the same judge who'd overseen the trial. Petters had the opportunity to speak, to show remorse, to acknowledge the pain he'd caused. He maintained his innocence. Judge Kyle had heard enough. "It just didn't pass the smell test," he said about Peters's testimony during the trial. The judge noted that he wasn't satisfied that if Petters were released early, he wouldn't return to a life of fraud. The sentence, 50 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. Tom Petters was 52 years old. 50 years meant he'd be over 100 if he served the full sentence. It was essentially a life sentence. He was taken immediately into custody and transported to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, the same prison that had held Al Capone decades earlier. But the legal aftermath was far from over. Other defendants still faced sentencing. Deanna Coleman, because of her cooperation and whistleblower status, received just 1 year and 1 day in federal prison. She could have faced 50 years like Petters, but her decision to go to the FBI and wear that wire saved her. While Deanna Coleman's assistance in the Petters investigation was extremely valuable, she still had to pay a price for her own wrongdoing. U.S. Attorney B. Todd Jones said at her sentencing, "She worked with Petters and others to dupe people out of a lot of money. However, in the end, she did the right thing by bringing this fraud into the light of day." Coleman served nearly 11 months before being released. She had to forfeit all her assets. Between 2001 and 2008, she'd been paid $19 million. It was all gone. Her homes, her cars, her jewelry. Everything was seized by the court-appointed receiver to be liquidated for victims. Bob White, who'd also pleaded guilty and cooperated, received a 5-year sentence. Larry Reynolds and the other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 17 years. Frank Venez, Petters's primary fundraiser, got 15 years. And then there was the massive job of trying to recover money for victims. Court-appointed receiver Doug Kelly spent over a decade searching for assets, liquidating properties, pursuing legal claims, clawing back what lawyers call phantom profits from investors who'd made money early in the scheme. It's a controversial practice. These early investors thought they'd made legitimate returns. They had no idea it was a Ponzi scheme. But legally, their profits came from later investors' losses, so the receiver could sue to recover that money and redistribute it more fairly. By July 2021, When Judge Ann D. Montgomery finally closed the receivership, more than $722 million had been distributed to victims and creditors. $722 million. That sounds like a lot. And it is. It was one of the largest recoveries in Ponzi scheme history. But remember the total losses? $3.65 billion. Victims got back about 20 cents on the dollar. Some got more, some got less. But nobody got made whole. Retirement accounts that had been worth millions were worth thousands. People who'd thought they were set for life had to go back to work in their 70s. Small business owners who'd invested their life savings lost everything. If you're over 50, think about that. Think about working your whole life, building up savings, maybe taking a chance on what seems like a solid investment with a successful Minnesota businessman. Then watching it all disappear, having to tell your spouse, your children, that the money's gone, that retirement is canceled, that you'll be working until you physically can't anymore. That's the real cost of fraud like this. It's not abstract numbers. It's real people with real lives that got shattered. Tom Petters, meanwhile, settled into life at Leavenworth. In 2012, 3 years after his conviction, he gave his only interview to Twin Cities Business Magazine. The reporter, Dale Kirshner, spent several hours inside the prison talking to him. Petters maintained his innocence throughout the interview. He claimed he'd only discovered the Ponzi scheme was operating shortly before the authorities were alerted. He said he'd been trying to fix it, to make things right, that if he'd just had a little more time, he could have worked it out. The interview painted Petters as a man in denial. He talked about his legitimate businesses, about his charitable work, about his family and the tailor shop his great-grandfather had founded. He positioned himself as a victim of Deanna Coleman and Bob White's betrayal. But the recordings don't lie. The bank records don't lie. The fake purchase orders don't lie. $12 billion moving through sham accounts over 5 years doesn't happen without the boss knowing. Tom Petters is currently 67 years old. He's been in federal prison for 15 years. He has 35 more to go. He'll be over 100 if he serves his full sentence. His appeals have been denied. His requests for reduced sentence have been rejected. The companies he bought? Polaroid has changed hands several times and exists now mainly as a licensing brand. Fingerhut continues to operate but under different ownership. Sun Country Airlines survived and is now publicly traded, completely divorced from the Petters name. The 3,200 employees who lost their jobs, they moved on, found new work, rebuilt their careers, but many of them still carry the stigma of having worked for Tom Petters. Through no fault of their own, they were associated with one of the biggest frauds in American history. The investors, some recovered through the receivership payments and lawsuits against banks and other parties. Some never recovered. Some are still fighting in court, trying to get something back. The pain doesn't end with a guilty verdict. Deanna Coleman served her time and disappeared from public life. She lives somewhere in north-central Minnesota under the weight of her choices. She saved herself by destroying the man she'd worked with for 15 years. The man she'd had an intimate relationship with. Was it conscience? Self-preservation? Both? Only she knows. Looking back, there were warning signs. The FBI visit in 2002. The too good to be true returns on investment. The lack of transparency in PCI's operations. The massive amounts of money moving through accounts without corresponding inventory or retail sales. But Tom Petters had built such a strong, legitimate facade that nobody looked too closely. When you own Polaroid, people assume you're successful. When the governor attends your charity gala, people assume you're trustworthy. That's the lesson here. The con artists who cause the most damage aren't the ones who look like criminals. They're the ones who look like success stories. They live in the right neighborhoods. They donate to the right causes. They know all the right people.
And they count on you not asking uncomfortable questions because questioning success feels awkward. How many Tom Petters are out there right now? How many seemingly legitimate businesses are actually shells for Ponzi schemes? How many charismatic businessmen are one whistleblower away from federal prison? The truth is, we don't know until they collapse. Ponzi schemes always collapse eventually. The mathematics guarantee it. You can't pay old investors with new investor money forever. At some point, you run out of new investors, or the economy turns and people pull their money, or someone on the inside develops a conscience and goes to the FBI. For Tom Petters, that moment came on September 8, 2008, when Deanna Coleman walked into that U.S. Attorney's office. Everything that happened after, the FBI raids, the trial, the 50-year sentence, all of it flows from that one decision. As you watch this video, Tom Petters is in a cell at Leavenworth. He eats prison food. He follows prison rules. He's just another inmate. The private jets are gone. The yachts are gone. The mansion on Lake Minnetonka belongs to someone else now. The Florida estate with the private beach and the dock. Someone else is watching those sunsets. And somewhere in Minnesota, there are elderly people still working jobs they should have retired from years ago because Tom Petters stole their future. There are families who didn't go to college because the education fund evaporated. There are people who can't afford medical care because their retirement savings disappeared into a Ponzi scheme disguised as consumer electronics deals. $3.65 billion, 10 years, thousands of victims, one whistleblower, one 50-year sentence. Everybody loved Tom Petters until they learned the truth.